Welcome to the Transatlantic, a podcast produced by the U.S. Helsinki Commission. Each episode, we will talk to people behind the debates and developments shaping the struggle for freedom and security here in the United States, Europe, Central Asia, and around the world. These conversations will cross oceans, intellectual divides, and political affiliations. We look forward to having you along for the ride. My name is Bakhti, and I'm a senior policy advisor at the Commission, and I will be your host.
It may strike many of your viewers and listeners as counterintuitive, but the Soviet leadership thought of itself as the vanguard of human rights in history. And there was a particular Soviet approach to human rights. The idea was we're going to do the West one better.
Benjamin Nathans teaches and writes about Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union, modern European Jewish history, and the history of human rights. Currently, he is the Endowed Term Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania. He authored Beyond the Pale, The Jewish Encounter with Late Imperial Russia, and his most recent book, To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement, which was awarded the 2025 Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction and the Pushkin House Book Prize, and many, many others. He is joining us today, and we are incredibly happy to have him. The book tells the story of dissent in the USSR from Stalin's death to the collapse of communism, exploring the idea and practice of rights and the rule of law in setting of mature socialism. Nathans is also a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books and the Times Literary Supplement. All right, Professor, thank you so much for joining us today on this Friday. It's a beautiful day here in Washington, D.C., and I hope it is in Pennsylvania, where you're at. So we're doing this remotely. Again, thank you for taking the time to do it. And I think in many ways...
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. No, thank you. It's a great honor. I think the timing could not have been better. I mean, better is probably not the right word, but only yesterday we learned that the famous, one of the most prominent human rights organizations of the late Soviet and Russian history, Memorial, was named an extremist organization by the Russian government. And I think this is going to be obviously, this is not supposed to be zeitgeisty per se, but I do think that frames the conversation that we're going to have today. And I think right off the bat, let me ask you this, and I think this is a fair question to start this conversation with. You've studied the Imperial Russia, you studied Soviet Russia, and just Soviet Union in general, but also I'm sure you're following Russia of today. When you look at dissident movements, and when you think about their history and how they came to be, how is contemporary Russia alike and different from the Soviet Union? And then I'll give you a background to why I'm asking this question. But let me ask you that: what are the similarities between what's happening in Russia today and what happened in the Soviet Union and potentially in Imperial Russia in terms of dissident movements?
Sure. Yes, and thank you again for inviting me onto your podcast. I'm really delighted to speak with you and your listeners. So the first thing I want to say is that the Soviet Union had a 74-year lifespan from 1917 to 1991, roughly the lifespan of a human being, but for a modern state, shorter than average. Within that lifespan, there were two extremely divergent periods. The formative years, the quarter century under Stalin, when the system really was formed, the Soviet system, and then the second act of Soviet history after Stalin died in 1953. So whenever people ask me, how do I think about Putin's Russia in comparison with the Soviet Union, it really depends on which Soviet Union. I'm not a big fan of comparisons between Putin and Stalin, if only because so many people were arrested and executed under Stalin. 18 million Soviet citizens passed through the Gulag. And the Soviet government can be held responsible for the deaths of at least 6 million Soviet citizens. The number could be quite higher depending on how you count it and how you determine the cause of death. There's nothing remotely like that happening under Putin, and I don't think it's likely that those kinds of extreme numbers of victims of state-sponsored violence are going to appear. But if we compare Putin to the second half of Soviet history, which, by the way, is the half in which he grew up, You know, he was born in the 1950s, grew up in Leningrad. He was formed by that system. I think he learned quite a few things about how to run a country from his perch as a KGB officer in Leningrad, in Dresden, and then back in Leningrad near the end of the Soviet Union. One of the things he learned, I think, is that you can, as a ruler, you can spare yourself a lot of headaches by simply encouraging troublemakers to leave the country. And when I say encouraging, you know, sort of with scare quotes around the word, making life unpleasant for real or perceived troublemakers. And since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022, about 1 million Russian citizens have fled. Some of them were young men who did not want to be drafted into the army for very understandable reasons. But a significant proportion of that roughly 1 million emigres are people who would have constituted the rank and file of a dissident movement or a protest movement or even just popular demonstrations. So Putin has learned how to use the safety valve of emigration to spare himself the headaches of an internal opposition. There are, of course, people in Russia today who are deeply opposed to the war against Ukraine, who are deeply opposed to the really striking authoritarian turn that the country has taken in the last 6 years or so, building up to the full-scale, 10 years, building up to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But I wouldn't say there's anything approaching a movement. Many of these people feel isolated. Their access to each other through social media is increasingly being blocked as the Russian government takes over what had been a fairly free internet in Russia, a kind of free speech zone online, the last oasis of free speech, which is disappearing really right now in front of our eyes.
Thank you for this nuanced answer to my question. The reason why I asked is a few weeks ago I was in Kiev and we met with the leader of Crimean Tatars. And, you know, this is a gentleman who in the 80s led the movement to bring Crimea, to get Crimean Tatars back to Crimea. And he said that he had spent 15 years in Soviet prisons. And he said, you know, but he said the crazy part is in Putin's Russia, in Crimea specifically right now, he said if he had done what he had done back then, he would have been in prison for life. And it was a striking comment because when we think about the Soviet Union, you know, we think of this dictatorial state where people, there's no freedom, no nothing, but somehow that in Crimea specifically, and I think the occupied territories is, you know, I'm not sure how fair it is to compare to Stalin's regime, but I do think the situation there is much, much worse than in Russia proper. He did say that he thought that it was that the Putin regime, that Putin's government was worse in many ways than the late Soviet. And I think what you described exactly fits that narrative. Let me this is a fascinating discussion, but one of the questions that I've always had is, somehow when we think about dissident movements, at least in the 20th century, I mean, we think about Soviet dissidents. I'm sure, I mean, there were others and there were other things happening. What made Soviet dissident movements so prominent? And probably more kind of a more complex question, what kind of a role United States potentially, or through our, you know, media, through, you know, Voice of America, RFRL, did we play any role in that?
The United States played an enormous role in the fate of the Soviet dissident movement. And the simple and easy answer to your initial question is the Cold War. The Cold War is what made the dissident movement headline news year after year after year, certainly in the West. And the most famous dissidents were household names in much of the world during the Cold War. So I don't mean that on a purely cynical level, that, you know, the internal enemies of our geopolitical enemy became our friends. That was certainly a factor. It was also the spectacle of dissidents deploying ideas of the rule of law, of civil rights, and eventually of human rights. They seemed to be speaking a language that was very similar to what the West itself was speaking during the Cold War. Part of my book is trying to show that while the dissidents arrived eventually at those languages, it was a long and complicated, twisting path to get there, and that we'll only really understand them as people, but also as historical actors, if we see them above all, as products of their own society, as Soviet people. That's the drama, is how this movement emerged from within that society. It eventually found a kind of common language with the West, and the West was played a huge role not just in the prominence of the movement, but in its communication networks. And you put your finger on one of the key mechanisms, namely the shortwave radio stations. Voice of America, BBC, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Deutsche Welle, and others that played an enormous role in getting the dissident message to Soviet citizens in this remarkable kind of boomerang mechanism where the dissidents would create what were called samizdat texts, texts that were hand-typed and distributed like chain letters, typed over and over again. And some of them made their way to the West, and then they would be broadcast back into the Soviet Union, not just in Russian, but in other Soviet languages, in what we would now call audiobooks. And the anecdotal evidence is overwhelming that millions and millions of Soviet citizens were listening to these broadcasts. So the Cold War and the West are a vital part of this story.
Incredible. Not to make it too political, but we've seen over the last year or so these tools that you were talking about. And I would want your honest opinion on this because it's 2026 and, maybe short form radio is not as potent a tool as it was, but we have in many ways, those tools that we're talking about, RFRL, Voice of America, and others, have come under massive fire and have been, in some cases, decimated, and they don't exist anymore.
Yes.
And I think what we've seen with this Iran war is that all of a sudden we need an ability to communicate with the people, but we don't have that. What is your opinion, in 2026, when we have TikToks and Instagrams and all that kind of stuff that, well, in Russia, obviously, everything, any meta product is considered extremist. People still have access to it. If we want to communicate with with the people on the inside, if we want to get their opinion, how important these tools are today?
My view is that the slashing of funding to these broadcast services by the U.S. government, and in particular Radio Free Europe and the Voice of America, is a catastrophically bad decision. It is really, it is, historians in a decade or two will describe this as the United States shooting itself in the foot. I would say that with the increasing encroachment of the Russian state on the internet in Russia, its attempt to create the equivalent of a kind of firewall around the internet and to create what Putin calls a Russian internet that can be controlled and monitored and punished by the Russian state. There has never been a time since the collapse of the Soviet Union when alternative forms of transnational communication have been more important. It's true that people with virtual private networks still have access to the internet outside of Russia. But I can easily imagine a time when even that will no longer be possible, or where the punishment for being caught using a virtual private network will be severe enough to intimidate people out of doing so. And in that case, access through shortwave broadcasts will be a vital link to the Russian population. So it is beyond idiotic to defund those organizations, in my opinion.
Thank you, Professor. You've studied Soviet Russian dissidents. One of the things that I was talking to one of my coworkers yesterday is that as I mature, you think about democracies, institutions, and principles that everybody abides by, and you think that's the foundation. But I think what I'm realizing now, it really depends on personal courage, on individual courage of each individual who's willing to go above and beyond, sacrifice, to make this sometimes ultimate sacrifice, to defend the things that they believe in. In your study of Soviet dissidents, I mean, the risks were enormous, right? I mean, these people were literally risking everything, not only just their personal freedom and lives, but also the lives and freedoms of their loved ones, which is, in many cases, is a harder bargain to make. What do you think drove these people? I mean, every single one of them, I mean, the names that, you said, the people, we used to know these people by their names. What do you think drove them? What is the thing that gave them this almost, above a human ability to withstand that pressure and to continue with the cause that they believed in?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and one that I obviously struggled with as I was writing this book, coming up with certain kinds of general principles that could help explain who joined this movement, who became active as a dissident in the 1960s and 70s. There have been many attempts to explain it sociologically. So I'm not the first to notice that there was a high proportion of people from the STEM fields in the dissident movement, scientists, computer scientists, mathematicians, engineers. And the argument was made that there was something about the scientific worldview, the demand for clear, rational, and testable arguments that put these people at odds with the secrecy and the arbitrariness of the Soviet regime, or that there was something about the way scientists conduct themselves, the openness of their conversations, the cosmopolitan nature of scientific research, where it really shouldn't matter what country you're from. What matters are the arguments and the experiments and the insights that you have brought to the surface. The problem, there is something to that, but the problem with that argument is that the vast majority of Soviet scientists, and there were many, and many very high quality scientists, world level scientific work being done in the Soviet Union. The problem is the vast majority did not join the dissident movement, and many of them were actually quite hostile to the movement because they thought it was going to jeopardize the very symbiotic relationship between the Soviet state and the scientific community, which was very well funded and very well taken care of, especially during the decades that the dissident movement was operating, the 1960s and 70s and early 80s. So basically, I don't want to go through the whole story, but all of the sociological explanations about why people joined movements, because of their scientific worldview or because their parents had been prisoners in Stalin's labor camps, they all ran up into this brick wall that the majority of people in that particular category did not join the movement. Eventually, what I found was that there is a common denominator among the dissidents, and that is that in one form or another, they hit a kind of stumbling block, as one of them put it, a moral dilemma that called into question their relationship to the Soviet state and, in most cases, to the security apparatus, to the KGB. They were faced with a difficult decision about whether to succumb to pressure to collaborate with the KGB, to inform on their friends or their fellow students or their colleagues. In other words, there was a kind of a moral crisis that called into question their patriotism, their obedience to the state, but also their sense of themselves. And the people who came to join the dissident movement were the ones who had such a strong conscience and a strong vision of themselves as conscientious actors in the world that they could not live with a version of themselves that collaborated with the KGB or that remained silent when the government did things that they just could not approve of, really dramatic gestures that they could not publicly go along with. So these are very high-minded and in many cases very stubborn people whose own high-mindedness made it difficult for them to engage in moral compromises, in contrast to the vast majority of the Soviet population and, frankly, to the vast majority of human beings. So it wasn't so much their social location in Soviet society, as an intellectual or as the daughter or the son of victims of Stalinist repression. It was their sense of themselves and the version of themselves that they wanted to preserve and not compromise.
Slightly broader point. I think over the last decade, and it's just not just to be clear, it's a right or a left wing talking point, but it seems human rights, democracy, freedom, all these things somehow have become things that people complain about, that we should not be talking about. The United States, specifically, United States government and our allies, that we should not be talking about those things, that we should not be promoting those ideas. That, again, the criticism from the left is that we only do it because for nefarious reasons, and we only pick on countries that we're not friends with. And the criticism from the right sometimes is that these are woke ideas. Why are we engaging in them anyway? You've studied this, and you know this is a powerful thing. This is what moves people. I mean, people have, as we've talked about, they did not believe that they're going to be successful, but they still fought for these things. These are powerful things. How do you think about it in contemporary context? I mean, is it something worth for the United States government and our friends and allies to continue talking about? Is this something that we should shy away from? Is it something that we should let societies, and again, there could be an argument, well, people themselves, societies themselves, a people should be able to kind of come to this themselves. How do you think about these days? I mean, is it worth investing in, or we should just let it flow and let it work out and let society settle on whatever they think is the best way to govern themselves?
Yeah. First thing I want to say is that if we ever arrive at the position, and we're not there now, but we're getting closer, if we ever arrive at the position where democracy is considered woke, we will have lost the game.
Yeah.
Game over. And anybody, in my opinion, who says democracy can be dismissed as wokeism is not only wrong, but is deeply un-American. I mean, is there any more core value to the American Republic than a democratic system of collective decision-making? I can't think of one. But you're asking a question not just about our own system, but about what we say to the world. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that there are sort of three options here. We can try to live the values that we hold dear, mm-hmm. democracy, the rule of law, civil rights, human rights, and not talk about it so much. Just let the example speak for itself. We can speak endlessly about the value of democracy and human rights and the rule of law, but not really observe it at home. Mm-hmm. That, to my mind, is the worst possible combination. Or we can abandon both what we do at home and the way we talk abroad and just operate as if this is a world based on might makes right and the powerful can do what they want and the rest of the people just have to put up with it. So of those three options, and I think we've tried them all at various different points in the timeline of American history, I favor the first. Mm-hmm. I favor, above all, prioritizing what we do at home and making the example of a flourishing democracy speak to the rest of the world. When we have that in place, whatever we say about the virtues of democracy and the rule of law will carry much more weight mm-hmm. in the rest of the world. People abroad, and this is totally understandable on a human level, what they cannot abide is a country that preaches human rights and doesn't practice them at home.
Right.
That is the worst thing you can do to human rights. Better to say nothing than to yak on about them but not observe them in your own backyard. So if the United States wants to be a credible spokesperson for any of these values in whatever mode, you know, in the mouth of the president, at international conferences, through shortwave radio broadcasts or other media communication with other countries, the only way that message is going to be taken seriously is if people have the feeling that we not only talk the talk, but walk the walk at home here in the United States.
Thank you, Professor. That's, again, incredibly nuanced, incredibly thoughtful answer. One question that I had, you know, we talked about how Putin sort of learned from second half of the Soviet Union, just push out those who don't agree, just keep the ones who just want to, you know, keep their heads down and do the daily tasks and not say much. The Soviet dissidents, even those who, I mean, in very minimal number, I mean, the numbers were not massive, obviously, but those who left the Soviet Union, they still made a difference for the Soviet Union. I mean, even on the when they were outside of the country, they talked about it, they made a difference, and people knew them both within and outside of a country. And right now, you had mentioned that close to 1 million people have left Russia, and there's most likely people who are, you know, opposition-minded, who do not agree with what's happening there. What are some of the lessons these folks, the contemporary dissidents, you know, even if they don't think of themselves as dissidents, but they just don't agree with that, what are some of the lessons they can take from that old Soviet dissident movement in terms of communicating with their countrymen and women back home in being able to convince them? Or how do they do it in a way that does not sort of scream, oh, I left because I think all of you are bad and I'm better than you? What are some of the lessons that they could, because I find that this is something that we thought early on that is going to just grow and be exponential, but I'm not seeing it too much. Maybe I'm wrong. What is your assessment, and what are some of the lessons learned from the Soviet dissident movement for the contemporary dissidents?
Sure. The first thing I want to say is that it's very challenging to influence the political climate, let alone actual policies in Russia from abroad. Emigre groups have an enormous challenge, not just in communicating with people in Russia, although there are still ways to do that, but in actually having an impact on the ground. It's very, very difficult. And the infighting and the rivalries within the emigre world, they're both regrettable but understandable given the relative powerlessness of many of those groups. In terms of the lessons of the dissident movement, I would say the situation in the late Soviet era certainly looked and felt even more hopeless than the one today. Most people, with just a handful of exceptions inside the Soviet Union in the 1960s and 70s, and quite a few people outside the Soviet Union, could not imagine that that country would cease to exist in 10 or 20 years. Yeah. It seemed to be an extraordinarily stable regime, a country that had survived the ultimate stress test of the Nazi invasion in the Second World War, which seemed to validate what the system had achieved, the socialist system. So we shouldn't underestimate the sense of hopelessness that was in the air among dissidents in the 60s and 70s, and how they persisted in spite of that sense of history not really being on their side. The other thing I think that's important to remember is that the dissidents used extremely creative means to broadcast their message. By using this technique of samizdat, of sort of hand-typed, hand-distributed texts, they did an end run around the official monopoly on printing and on mass media. They sort of invented their own version of the internet before there was an internet. Only it was even better than the internet in some ways because nobody owned it. It was an ownerless technology. Nobody owned servers. Nobody could block access. And the KGB was going crazy trying to suppress samizdat, and it gradually began to understand that there was no central factory where samizdat was being produced, and if you could just shut down that factory, game over. Samizdat was an incredibly dispersed technology of textual reproduction, and that was its glory. Similarly, the Soviet legal system looked like it was entirely stacked against the dissidents. You didn't really have an independent judiciary. Anytime a dissident was put on trial, and there were dozens of political trials of dissidents in the 60s and 70s, the KGB would just call up the judge before the trial began and say, okay, you're going to give 7 years to this guy and 5 years to that woman. And the verdicts were always guilty and sentences to prison or to the labor camps. But the political fallout, the public relations fallout from these trials was almost always on the side of the dissidents. So they somehow managed to leverage a very inhospitable legal system to their own advantage. So game is not over. And the dissident example shows that against extraordinary odds, this relatively small movement was able to have a completely outsized impact in its own time.
That is incredible, and I think this is a message of hope. I mean, for everyone who's watching Russia, and I think the timelines get shortened, right, when you're looking at what's happening right now. But that's an incredibly powerful message, and one filled with hope, to be perfectly honest. But the one question to follow up on that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because maybe my perception of it is incorrect. It seems like as much as Soviet Union, obviously, cynical state that is trying to, that is abusing its own citizens and whatnot, but it was, to an extent, was driven by an ideology. And it seems like, when you're trying to shame a political regime that prides itself on equality, on fairness, justice, and all of these things, when you from the outside or from the inside, you try to shame it, that somehow it does break through that potentially very thick skin, that they would react to it. I mean, I remember reading about it, how if there was a criticism of a case of a dissident in Soviet Russia, Soviet Union, that Soviet authorities would react to it. I mean, not that they would release that person, but they would, improve maybe the conditions. And it seems Putin's government is completely the opposite, where it's just there's absolutely no shame, there's no nothing drives them. We don't know what they want. There is no sort of state ideology per se, and that makes it very difficult for us to somehow shame them. Is that a correct perception, or is this something? How could we think about it in terms of contemporary Russia?
I think that observation is spot on, 100%. It may strike many of your viewers and listeners as counterintuitive, but the Soviet leadership thought of itself as the vanguard of human rights in history. And there was a particular Soviet approach to human rights. The idea was, we're going to do the West one better. These are not just going to be rights on paper. The government is going to actually make sure that things like civil liberties are real, are genuine, by providing printing presses and paper to the workers, by providing physical spaces where people can hold rallies, rather than these abstract, airy promises of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. They were going to make them real by providing the material prerequisites for making those things real. So you're right. Soviet leaders were extremely sensitive to criticism of their human rights record, precisely because they had this self-image as the vanguard of human rights protection. It's, most people kind of do a jaw drop when I tell them that this is the way Soviet leaders thought about the topic. And you're right, Vladimir Putin does not have that same irritation when people criticize his human rights record, and there's plenty to criticize. I think that's for two reasons. One is, like most of his compatriots, he has abandoned all of the remnants of Marxism-Leninism and the approach to things like rights that went along with them. So he doesn't carry the same ideological commitment to being the vanguard of rights development in human history. But more important, he is so utterly convinced that when the West complains about Russia's human rights record, it's being entirely hypocritical. And frankly, there's so much evidence that he can marshal that that is the case, that he literally does not care about those criticisms. And that's a real problem, because that lack of caring about that kind of criticism has deprived us of a certain form of leverage that we really did have in the Soviet period. That's gone.
Thank you so much. That's, again, a lot of, I don't like this word, but I think there's a lot of actionable items just based on that piece. I think there's a lot for us to think about as policymakers and people who are listening, watching this, that they hopefully can realize and understand and use that. One other question that I actually have many, but just cognizant of your time, a couple of questions that I have for you, sir, is, it seems like, I mean, just comparative, Jewish population of the Soviet Union was not massive, but it had an outsized presence and importance in Soviet dissident history.
It did.
Is that part of it? Because this is something you also write and on. Is there a history of, because this is something that, again, people don't really talk about or prefer not to discuss, or because of their own political leanings, but this history of anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union, did it contribute to it, or what was the driving force behind this? Again, it's just factual observation, right? It's not, making anything up, but why do you think that was the case?
Yeah, again, you've put your finger on a very important topic, which I do treat in the book, namely that Jews were, by many factors, were overrepresented as compared with their percentage of the population. It depends a little bit on who you count as Jewish, one Jewish parent, two Jewish parents, but Jews were never more than 3% of the Soviet population. but they were many times that percentage of the dissident movement. And this kind of gets me back to what I was talking about earlier, the attempt to use social categories or identity categories like scientist or Jewish to explain why certain people, significant numbers of people, joined this movement. And there again, I bumped up into the same problem, which is that while there were a really striking proportion of Jews inside the movement, the overwhelming majority, 99% of Soviet Jews did not join the dissident movement. And therefore, it really makes it hard to say, oh, there's a certain Jewish worldview, or thinking of yourself as a victim of state-sponsored anti-Semitism might drive you to do that, or there's something about a Jewish upbringing, Jewish teachings, Jewish values. How then would you explain the overwhelming majority of Jews having nothing to do with the movement? So it's tricky. It's an analytically complicated question to try to address. What I think can be said is that a high proportion of Soviet Jews perceived themselves in the 1960s and 70s as increasingly outsiders to the system. Their parents' generation had succeeded extraordinarily well under Soviet power. At a certain price, I mean, they really couldn't publicly express their Jewish identities, especially if that identity included religious observance. But in terms of education and ability to live in desirable places like Moscow and Leningrad and Kiev, the ability to enter prestigious professions like physics and math and filmmaking and journalism, their parents' generation had succeeded fantastically well. But those who came of age in the 60s and 70s did not experience that kind of upward mobility. If anything, they were facing downward mobility. And that may have been a factor leading them to be at least more susceptible to the kinds of approaches that the dissident movement advocated, namely trying to hold the Soviet government to its own laws and to contain the arbitrary power of the Soviet state. But it's very difficult to tie one's social identity or social background to the question of did or did not that person, was that person drawn to the movement or not?
Thank you so much for that answer, Professor. I think we've covered a lot, but one of the things that just looking at your bio and looking at the things that you've covered, how did you get invested in this topic? I mean, the dissident movement was it something that you'd studied, something that you'd done, someone you talked to? How did it spark? Because, I mean, you are the preeminent authority on this in the United States, at least. I genuinely wonder, because I think a core of our audience are younger folks who are just kind of thinking about what they want to do with their lives and whatnot. How did you get into this, and why is this such a driving force for you?
Yeah. It wasn't a straight line or an obvious book for me to take on. I developed a kind of curiosity about how people who live in authoritarian systems, how they think about their political options, especially for public political engagement, sort of what the world looks like to people in authoritarian systems when it comes to being politically active. And because of my training, the natural place for me to use as a laboratory to answer that question was always going to be Russia and the Soviet Union. That's one of my specialties. But in the back of my mind was always this sense that what I learned from that would probably be of some interest to people in places like China or Iran or North Korea. So I thought of it as a kind of not just a specifically Soviet puzzle, but something that had broader interest and maybe broader application. I submitted the finished manuscript to my publisher in the summer of 2023, never imagining that by the time my book came out, people would be saying, oh, maybe in the United States we could learn something from this. Yes. Maybe the trajectory of the dissident life can shed some light on what people in the United States are asking themselves. What are our options for political engagement in an era of sort of creeping authoritarianism? So that I honestly did not see coming. I really did not see that coming. But I think it accounts for at least part of the attention that the book is getting and the reception that it's got in a way that was just serendipitous for me as the author. I did not plan it that way, but I think that's part of the resonance of the book in the United States, is that suddenly the questions and the puzzles that I raise feel a lot closer to home than they did while I was writing it.
Whatever you believe in, providence, coincidence, I do think what you said is 100% spot on. And I think there are lessons that we all can take away from this, regardless of where you live, regardless what you believe in. And I do think this message, the general message of hope that the book, you can see it in the entire book. I do think it's important, but also that it's hard work, that it just doesn't happen accidentally, that it does take sacrifice on part of true believers in a cause. As a parting thought, what would be your message to people, in Russia, in people in Ukraine, people in the United States, in Europe, anywhere? What's your message about the cause? Again, Ukrainians are fighting for their very existence. There are Russians that are fighting for the definition of who they are and what this century is going to define Russia as, right? Whether it's going to be this colonialist, horrendous dictatorship, or potentially a country that can be at peace with itself and its neighbors. There are people in the United States and in Europe fighting to define what they are. And I think one of the things that I see in your book is that it's just a definition of who we are as people, as a nation, as a group, and whatnot. What is your message to everyone who is grappling with these ideas and thoughts? And it seemed like 2 decades, 3 decades ago, it's just like we had won. Democracy is on the rise. Everything's going to be okay. We're just going to let it kind of go for a little bit, and everyone will be on the same page. Free markets, free movements, free people. Again, democracy, human rights for everyone. And clearly that's not been the case. Yet I do think that the message in your book is, in the darkest times, it's very important to keep that hope. It's very important that you continue. What is the message to the people who are grappling, again, I'm repeating myself, grappling with this question right now, anywhere in the world?
Yeah. The groups that you mentioned in Russia, in Ukraine, in Europe, in the United States are going through rather different experiences. I mean, especially the Ukrainians, they are literally fighting for their survival as a people. So it's tricky to generalize. But here I'll take a stab at it. Here's what I would say. First of all, with all due respect to Thomas Jefferson, the notion that the truths that you mentioned are self-evident is no longer tenable. They're clearly not self-evident. They are not things that we can take for granted. And the sooner we stop seeing them as self-evident and assuming that when the Cold War was over, history had ended and that everyone was going to arrive at a liberal, democratic, free market order was unbelievably naive. That lesson needs to be absorbed. And when we stop taking those values as self-evident is when we can start defending them in a deliberate, mindful, intentional way. So that's very important. The thing that I think they can take from the book and from the story and the human lives that I try to make vivid in the book is that there have been people, and I'll leave the Ukrainians out of this since they're fighting for their survival right now, but for the other cases, there have been people in much darker times than the ones that we are currently experiencing who did not give up hope, who maintained a sense of possibility, and who above all understood that no matter how dark the circumstances, there are always choices. They never succumbed to the idea that they had no choice. There are always choices to be made. They may be extremely constrained. They may not be the optimal choices that one would like to have, but there are always choices between better and worse responses to any given challenge or crisis. And being aware and mindful about what those choices are and which one to select for yourself, I think is something that we should never lose sight of. And that's one of the takeaways of the book, for me at least.
Professor Nathans, this has been an incredible conversation, again, filled in my opinion, with hope, with realism, with pragmatism, and with actual advice about, I think that choice, the matter of choice, is incredibly important. And people forget that every day you wake up and you have a choice, regardless of your circumstances. And I genuinely appreciate that. On that slightly positive note, we're gonna finish this podcast, but we will be happy to have you on again in a little bit of time to sort of maybe look back and look at what's happening in the world and whether it's going in the right direction or wrong direction according to you. Thank you so much again. Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
I really enjoyed speaking with you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.